Some men aren't looking for anything logical, like money. They can't be bought, bullied, reasoned, or negotiated with. Some men just want to watch the world burn.
Hi, my name's John, and for those of you who aren't familiar, I'm working on getting my master's degree in clinical mental health counseling. So today, I wanted to take a look at one of the most complex and nuanced characters in all of Persona 4 Golden, and that is Tohru Adachi, and how he got to the point he's at when we meet him in the game, and where he goes next. So if you like this kind of content, you want to see more of it coming from the channel, make sure to like the video, ring the notification bell so you never miss another upload, and make sure to subscribe and share this video wherever you like sharing things, because we would really appreciate if you helped us get to 7,500 subscribers before the end of December. But with all of that out of the way, let's just jump into the video. Now, while we don't know too much about Adachi's upbringing or his life before the beginning of the game, what little we do know actually gives us a shocking amount of context into who he has become by the time that we meet him. In his third social link, Adachi reveals to us that growing up, all he really cared about were his grades, and that as he was going through school, his parents didn't care what he did as long as his grades were good. Now, while this line of dialogue may seem fairly innocuous within the context of the game, if we add the additional scenes from Persona 4 Golden, the anime, that shows us what his experiences in school were like, it paints a very distinct picture. Adachi was always alone, passing up any and all opportunities to get involved with the people around him in favor of working hard to study to get good grades. This in turn led to Adachi becoming really isolated and prevented him from having the opportunity to develop any true connections until his adult life. But why did Adachi isolate himself so profoundly growing up? Well, to start understanding this, I think we really need to look at attachment styles. Now, if you've watched this channel before, you may have heard me talk all about John Bowlby's attachment styles and how they've impacted the development of so many characters from the Persona franchise. But if you're not familiar, then Bowlby's theory, to keep it simple, is that there are two types of attachment, being secure or comfortable in one's attachments, or insecure, where attachments may be approached with much more hesitation. So all in all, it's pretty self-explanatory, but the insecure attachment style actually has three subtypes: avoidant, anxious, and disorganized. So with this in mind, I think that we can pretty safely deduce that Adachi can be characterized with an avoidant attachment style, or his inclination is to emotionally distance himself from the people around him, leading a life that appears to be much more independent on the outside, and having much more of a tendency to turn inward for support as opposed to those external supports, in turn leading to a higher likelihood of dismissing the importance of having relationships or having very few qualms with breaking them off. And so, if my assumption is correct, Adachi's parents may not have cared much about what he did, like he briefly describes, and only really cared about his grades. Now, this could have two effects. It could leave him having his emotional needs not met in any meaningful capacity, and it could place an incredible amount of pressure on him to succeed academically. I think it's safe to say that this led to him placing almost no value on interpersonal relationships moving forward, and instead only striving for success both academically and, in the future, his career. Though, just because an individual is inclined to distance themselves from others, this doesn't inherently mean that they don't want to or shouldn't try to have relationships with the people around them. And Adachi shows time and time again that while he definitely doesn't seek out relationships, there's likely a part of him that still unconsciously wants them. We can see this pretty clearly in his social link, where we watch as he develops a relationship with a kind older woman who he describes as being the exact opposite of his parents, and she regularly brings him Nemono because he has the exact same name as her son. While this seems like just a plotline to fill time and to give Adachi a purpose to have a social link in Persona 4 Golden, it hits at something much more nuanced about his character, that even though he may complain about this older woman who keeps bringing him food, even if her kindness and generosity may in fact be irritating to him, I genuinely believe that there's a part of Adachi that started becoming close to this woman and to appreciate her. But as is always the case in his life, the moment her true son, who could be perceived as much more successful than Adachi, shows up, he's put back in second place, with Adachi saying sadly that it doesn't have to be him, before reinforcing to you that he likes being alone. And maybe this is him reinforcing to you that he likes this, or maybe he's reinforcing that for himself. While he may have been starting to develop a bit of a friendly relationship with this older woman, the second he found a reason to cut it off, he did. Why would she care about him when she could have her real son? Truth be told, this hits at one of Adachi's major insecurities, which is inadequacy. Whether it was via his grades while he was in school or through his career as a police officer, Adachi has always seen the world as being very black and white, even describing it as being divided into two distinct camps, those with talent versus those without talent, or to simplify it even further, those who are good versus those who are bad. And this indicates a defense mechanism that he likely uses a lot, known as splitting, which is defined by the American Psychological Association as being a primitive defense mechanism used to protect oneself from conflict, in which objects provoking anxiety and ambivalence are dichotomized into extreme representations with either positive or negative qualities, resulting in polarized viewpoints that fluctuate in extremes of seeing the self or others as either all good or all bad. We see Adachi do this in a number of places, but when we really think about it, he always places himself into this supposedly bad or inadequate category within his mind. Whether it's him believing himself to be seen as lesser than the old woman's son who shares his name, his perception of what the police force actually thinks of him for sending to work in a nowhere place like Inaba, or even if we're going to take a single aspect from the Persona 4 Golden anime, perhaps that he's lesser than you, the one who he thinks took his place within the Dojima family. But simply understanding his attachment style doesn't explain why he committed the crimes he did. So I suppose we need to address the elephant in the room and really understand how he perceives the world around him once he's able to obtain the power to place individuals within the TV.
Reasons? None, really. I could do it, that's all. And it was fun.
So often when we hear the term antisocial, our mind instantly thinks of someone who doesn't enjoy socializing with the people around them. And while this certainly is true of Adachi, that's more indicative of someone who's asocial, especially if we're operating under the impression that he has an avoidant attachment style. But this isn't what antisocial means. The American Psychological Association defines antisocial behavior as being behaviors that sharply deviate from social norms and also violates other people's rights. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that killing two people and manipulating Namatame, a man who is having some profound personal and psychological struggles into throwing his targets into the TV, would certainly fall under the criteria of violating the rights of others and sharply deviating from social norms. But Adachi's behaviors transcend just momentary antisocial inclinations. I believe that Adachi shares a striking amount of similarities with an individual who would be diagnosed with a severe version of antisocial personality disorder based on the 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual's criteria. Before we dive too far in though, I want to preface this by saying that according to the criteria, to be able to be diagnosed with an antisocial personality disorder, there must be evidence of conduct disorder prior to the age of 15. And since we don't know too much about Adachi's past other than that of his study habits and what little we know of his parents, I can't say with any real certainty that this was or was not present. And so I just want to go through the criteria within the DSM and see how well Adachi's behaviors line up. And where better to start looking at Adachi's behavior than with the first murder of Mayumi Yamano, the TV host who was in an affair with Taro Namatame. As we watch the scene unfold in Adachi's recollection of the event, we can see a fair amount of signs of potential antisocial behavior here alone. Adachi called Miss Yamano down to the lobby to inquire about her affair while he was technically on guard duty for her with the police, and the moment that she refused to answer his question, this happened.
It was an accident. She started struggling. What else was I supposed to do? I called her out to the lobby because I wanted to ask her something, and then she started getting hysterical on me.
Who are you? And what's this something important you called me out here for?
What they say on the news isn't true, is it? All that talk about you having an affair and whatnot, it's all a lie, right?
Why do I have to explain myself to you?
I see. So you don't deny it. You caught my eye. But it turns out you're another worthless bitch.
What's wrong with you? Don't make me call for help.
Shut up. Shut up. Shut up! I think you need to see what it's like to fear for your life. It'll get your head straight.
What are you going to do? No! Ah!
She fell in. Wow! So people can go completely inside!
Now, just this clip in isolation displays several very key traits of a severe antisocial personality disorder, or at least antisocial symptoms. And so if I'm ever talking about a specific piece of DSM-5 criteria, I'll pop it into the left-hand corner of the screen. But I want to preface everything I say with a huge asterisk. Please do not use any of the criteria mentioned in this video to diagnose yourself or others. If you have any mental health concerns, please consult with a mental health professional in your area. But with all that out of the way, the first piece of true evidence that I can find that point towards his antisocial tendencies is his impulsivity and his failure to plan ahead. Now, obviously, we can see within the context of this scene that this is true, because at the time, he wasn't even sure whether the allegations of Miss Yamano's affair were even real. So shoving her into the TV was a very spur-of-the-moment decision. But this impulsive behavior ties directly into the next two diagnostic criteria, which are his irritability and aggressiveness, as indicated by repeated physical fights and assaults within the game, and his reckless disregard for the safety of himself and others. I don't really need to explain these two, I don't think, as when he gets frustrated with Miss Yamano, he quite literally grabs her and throws her into the TV without having any concept of the consequences of those actions. But of course, these aren't isolated incidents by any means, as the incidents with Saki Konishi and Mitsuo Kubo followed very similar formulas, with Saki dying just as Miss Yamano did and Mitsuo being narrowly saved by the investigation team. It's pretty clear that Adachi constantly refused to adhere to societal norms and used his position as a police officer to pull off each and every one of these incidents, which are inherent grounds for arrest. But he didn't simply use his position as a means to commit murder himself. When Taro Namatame called into the station to warn them that he believed that Yukiko might be the next victim, Adachi found his golden goose to perpetuate his game. This situation in particular is fascinating, because while his first two murders were impassioned by his impulsivity and agitation of feeling attacked and inadequate, his use of Namatame is much more premeditated. This use of Namatame for his game of cat and mouse with the investigation team illustrated his inclination towards deceitfulness, as he tricks Namatame into thinking that he's saving all of the people he's throwing into the TV, all for Adachi's own pleasure. And so when they are genuinely saved by the investigation team, the cycle continues over and over again, while Adachi is watching it unfold, making the quiet town of Inaba much more interesting for him. And all of this is compounded and to an extent motivated by his experience of dysphoria, a state of unease or generalized dissatisfaction with life, which manifests itself as Adachi's inability to tolerate boredom. So what does he do to satiate this boredom for a moment? He always returns to his game. And so if this hypothesis of an antisocial personality disorder, or at least the characteristics of one, is correct, then his lack of even a hint of empathy when paired with his overly cocky and self-assured attitude when talking about his victims and stating how he committed these crimes simply because he could, and because it was fun, without any worries that the investigation team might catch on to what he was doing, because how could they? makes a lot of sense. It wasn't even him committing the crimes in his mind anymore. It was Namatame. All of his bases were covered. And this arrogance in light of the chaos that he was enabling in the quiet town of Inaba is what brings me to point out the final piece of diagnostic criteria that could be indicative of an antisocial personality disorder, which is his clear lack of remorse for his actions that clearly have an adverse effect on a lot of people, but also his rationalization of his actions, which can be seen in full display when he is explaining his plan to the investigation team. Adachi explains to them how both Saki Konishi and Mayumi Yamano deserve to go into the TV for flirting with Namatame and supposedly being gold diggers, and so he did absolutely nothing wrong because they had it coming to them anyways. But let's be honest here, these claims, while he may believe them to be true, are only one piece of the puzzle. A lot of his more aggressive antisocial behaviors tend to be prompted by his feelings of inadequacy. Throwing Miss Yamano and Saki Konishi into the TV because he thought they didn't see him as being good enough for them are key examples of this. But the most visceral example being the fact that the moment Yosuke calls him worthless after the investigation team had essentially just gotten done tearing apart every piece of his character, this sends him into a frenzy, and this is when he attacks the investigation team. It's very possible that this aggression, while a symptom of his antisocial tendencies, is also a defense mechanism of displacing his own self-loathing onto those who are immediately in his crosshairs in the form of this aggressive behavior. Adachi, towards the end of the game, is a man who has no apparent empathy or concern for the well-being of the people around him. A man who doesn't care about violating the rights of others just so long as it satiates his boredom, and even further driven by his resentment for the world that shoved him into the small town of Inaba. So that about wraps it up, right? Throughout the entirety of the game, he was just lying to you, the Dojimas, and everyone else, simply playing a part to throw the scent off him, right? Well, to an extent, this is kinda true. And it would be easy to just close the book here, but doing so would be an immense disservice to his character. And so, looking at Adachi after the defeat of Amano Sagiri, I want to return to our discussion of his attachment style and the importance of bonds, or lack thereof, within his life.
As you all insisted at the time, I'll abide by the rules of this world.
Something that really struck me after the investigation team finally succeeded in defeating him is the distinct shift in Adachi's personality that we see. While he certainly isn't the funny, lighthearted Adachi that we got to know throughout the game, he also isn't the arrogant misanthrope that we encountered at the beginning of the battle, ready to change everyone into shadows. Now, the game doesn't exactly make it clear to what extent Adachi was being controlled by Amano Sagiri after he received his persona. Whether he was controlled by Amano Sagiri or not, I think Naoto puts it best when she states that everything he did was likely, at least in part, his will and intent as well. But as Yu comes to talk with him, he admits that if he had been more like you, things may have worked out differently for him. While this could, on the surface, seem like a pretty innocuous statement, I think that this very much hits at the essence of Adachi's character. He is a very human representation of someone with a predisposition towards deceit and aggression that perceives the world to have beaten him down by telling him he wasn't talented enough to go anywhere but Inaba in his career, and that all this led to a breaking point where he completely unjustifiably assaulted Miss Yamano. However, I need to be very clear that a person is much more than the sum of their symptoms. If we look at people as their diagnoses, in this case being an antisocial personality disorder potentially, then we completely strip them of all other characteristics from their identity, and that is something that we should never do. But I think that this is the moment that helps us to be able to reground to see that just because he was the antagonist and definitely did evil things, we need to look at the larger picture, which is that Adachi still has the opportunity to grow as a person in a number of different ways. While he may never fully atone for his crimes, he can certainly make an effort, with the first step being the realization that maybe he could let some people into his internal world. While we discussed earlier that he was predisposed to being more avoidant in terms of his attachments, I think that whether it was due to natural character growth or the removal of Amano Sagiri's influence, Adachi genuinely let his guard down just enough to afford opportunity of maybe letting people in someday. And this is reinforced in his letter to you at the end of the game, where he says that he will serve his term, and that he's been thinking about the Dojimas a lot since he's been locked up, alluding to the idea that maybe he'll be more open to letting people in the future, like Ryotaro, Nanako, and Yu, and that he's willing to serve his time in prison, abiding by the rules of the real world. Now, in terms of real psychology, this abrupt change in Adachi, while certainly not impossible, is kind of unlikely if we're being real. But I suppose when we're talking about an individual who's quite literally possessed by a godlike being inside a TV world, some suspension of disbelief is kind of acceptable here, I think. Regardless though, this marks a distinct turning point in Adachi's story and character moving forward. Yes, he has antisocial tendencies, and yes, he may not be immediately drawn to the idea of interpersonal relationships, and I by no means want to downplay the severity of his actions, but in Persona 4 Arena Ultimax, we get the chance to see how he is able to keep his word to the investigation team, to abide by the rules of the real world, but I think more importantly, how he is actually able to become more like you by beginning to acknowledge the bonds that he's formed.
When I'm here, I think of Dojima-san, Nanako-chan, and you. A lot.
When we're reintroduced to Adachi in Persona 4 Arena Ultimax, he's still in jail and being shockingly cooperative with the police who are investigating the murders and disappearances in Inaba. This is until the interrogating officer criticizes Dojima, with this action in particular triggering something very telling within Adachi, because the moment he hears this, he goes on the offensive against the interrogating officer, an action that in no way benefits him. He begins pointing out the unethical methods that the interrogating officer has used on suspects in the past, which unsurprisingly aggravates him to the point that he assaults Adachi. This, while it's such a small moment, shows us that despite his very egocentric presentation throughout the course of this new game, acting like he's only doing what's best for himself, just like he did in Persona 4, in reality, it illustrates to us perfectly that he does in fact have a soft spot for his former boss. In essence, Adachi's story provides him with a new foil to illustrate his growth in the form of Sho Minazuki, the game's primary antagonist, who brings Adachi into the TV world to help him summon a demon to get rid of everyone so that he can have a world of solitude. A plan that's not dissimilar to Adachi's plan from Persona 4. While Adachi agrees to help him instead of being killed, throughout the course of the game he's constantly working to undermine Minazuki's efforts. Adachi even says it himself, that he can see where Sho's coming from by wanting to destroy the world and all of the terrible people in it, which is an uncharacteristically empathetic stance for him to take considering his prior antisocial tendencies within Persona 4 Golden. But the game makes it clear that Adachi no longer shares this worldview. To make a long story short, this all culminates with Adachi confronting Sho Minazuki just before the destructive plan comes to fruition to stop them once and for all. In this line of dialogue really says it all from Adachi.
I was gonna let your crap slide until I showed you the end of the world you never got to achieve. Why not? Right?
Don't think we're the same, you little brat.
What? What was that?
You think the whole world hates you just because someone didn't treat you right. You're nothing but a little kid throwing a tantrum. You know, I seriously hate this world. Don't put me in the same shoes as a half-assed brat like you. Please?
Being reminded of who he was a year ago frustrates him. This actually kind of made me think about a concept that within the realm of mental health counseling is known as parallel processing. Now this is a term that has several different meanings in a variety of different fields, but in counseling specifically, this is when a therapist and their supervisor are interacting and the therapist recreates or parallels the client's problems by way of relating to the supervisor. Essentially meaning that the therapist unintentionally mirrors the client's behaviors when working with their supervisor. The reason that I bring this up in particular is because in this clip, Adachi does something, while not entirely the same, but strikingly similar in his interaction with Sho at the end. He uses almost the exact same logic that the investigation team used against him to oppose Sho's ideology and plan to destroy the world as we know it. And so in this new interaction, he is taking the role of the investigation team, just like a therapist would take the role of a client when talking with their supervisor. And I don't think that he does this consciously by any means. In the final conflict at the end of Persona 4, the investigation team made such an impact on Adachi that without him realizing it, he slowly became entangled with the party, and therefore his actions have, to a certain extent, been influenced by them. And so Adachi stands in opposition to a man who might as well have been him a year earlier. Now, I'm not saying that all of a sudden he's a selfless white knight, not by any means, but I am saying it is here that he allows himself to be beaten to a pulp and willingly stands side by side with his former polar opposite Yu to destroy a common enemy.
Life in lockup is much easier than your grueling training.
Adachi had promised to live by the rules of the world and serve out whatever sentence he was given, and he clung to these rules. No matter how bored he was, no matter what Sho dangled in front of his face, he didn't want to die and have the murder case reopened. And it is this resolve that shows us just how far Adachi has come. And when he and Yu prevail, he heads back to the real world once and for all, operating under the assumption that Adachi does indeed still have some degree of antisocial tendencies based on some of the criteria we listed earlier. It's abundantly clear that he has found a way to keep himself in check. By focusing so profoundly on following this new set of rules, he's able to keep his head down and really do well with his self-regulation as he serves the jail time deemed necessary for his transgressions, however boring that might be to him. But I think that if anything, the thing that we should all take away from this game is that while he may have done awful things, Adachi is not his crimes. He was a man who convinced himself that he didn't care about anyone around him. He felt like the world betrayed him and sent him out to rot alone, and so he wanted revenge on that world that he believed deemed him so worthless. But that's not the same man that we see at the end of Persona 4 Arena Ultimax that Dojima visits in jail. While he certainly has a long and arduous road ahead of him, it's here that he realizes that having a bond like the one he has with Dojima may not be so bad, and thus he finally accepts what he has been running away from and resisting for so long, a true connection. Adachi isn't pure evil, and he never was. He just needed someone who, regardless of what he'd done, to accept him. And while he may not have appreciated or been willing to see it at first, he got that from the Dojimas. And so while Nowheresville Inaba may have been the site of his greatest failure and his greatest crimes, it's also the home of the people who still see the value in him, regardless of what he's done. But that'll do for today's video, guys, and I want to pass the question off to you. What are your thoughts on Tohru Adachi? Is he redeemable? Is he not? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, why not liking the video, subscribing, and why not even ringing that notification bell so you never miss another upload. And make sure to share this video wherever you like sharing things because it helps the channel so incredibly much. And if you're interested in talking to some really awesome, cool people, why not checking out our Discord, which will be linked in the description down below. It's really a lot of fun and I highly recommend it. But as always, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, a fantastic rest of your week, and even a fantastic rest of your month. And I will see you in the next video. Later.